We all know the enigmatic story of Moses sending 12 spies to scout the land of Canaan at the request of the Jewish people who were not satisfied with God's statement to them that this is the land of milk and honey, this is the promised land. But they wanted to send spies to make sure that the land is indeed the good land that they were told it was. They wanted to make sure that they will be able to conquer the land. And the spies, 10 of the 12, came back with this terrible slanderous report against Israel. And as a result, the people started crying. That happened to be the night of Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, which God said, you're crying for no good reason. This will be a night and day that you will be crying in the future, which of course was the prediction of the destruction of the two temples which were destroyed on Tisha B'Av, and many other great tragedies that are enumerated in the Mishnah and many others that happened in the post-Talmudic era. So this was a terrible tragedy, and it all came back to the spies who, 10 of which were imbued with the wrong notion of God's power to conquer the land. They didn't believe they could conquer the land, which is a little bit strange because, after all, these are the same people who witnessed the 10 plagues in Egypt, the splitting of the Red Sea and the drowning of the Egyptian army. They witnessed the war against Amalek and other wars that happened in the desert, and miraculously, Jews came out victorious. And all of these miracles, the manna from heaven and many other miracles, was not enough to convince them that God could conquer the land. But before we answer that question, there's another question. There's a translation of the Torah in Aramaic known as the translation of Yonatan, the Talmudic sage Yonatan ben Uziel. Some say that it's not really his, but it's other sages. But either way, it's an accepted midrashic interpretation, commenting on the words of the Torah that before Moses sent Joshua, who was one of the two good spies who did not accept the report of the other spies, that Moses renamed him. His name was originally Hosea, and he added a yud, became Yehoshua. And what does that mean? Yehoshua has God's name in it, the first two letters, the yud and the hey, and the rest of the name means salvation. God will save you from the counsel of the spies. Now, why did Moses pray for Yehoshua? Why didn't he pray for the others? He didn't pray for Kalev, the other good spy. Why did he pray for Yeshua? What was special about Yeshua, or what was maybe not so special about him, that required Moses' prayer? And the Targum Yonasan says, when Moses saw Yeshua's humility, he prayed for him, that God should protect him, that he shouldn't give in to the counsel of the evil spies, which of course requires explanation in its own right. What does it mean? Because he was humble? Usually humble people are much more God-fearing. So the simple explanation is, because of his humility, he may defer to the other spies and say, well, if they say it's not going to be possible to conquer the land, if they say the land is not such a good land, who am I to disagree with them? But it still leaves a lot to be desired, because after all, humility, when we talk about humility in the biblical context, it usually means someone who is very, very much receptive to God's word. And here we're using it in the opposite way, receptive to those who were speaking against God. It was clear that they were speaking against. God says we can conquer the land, and Yeshua says, no, we can't conquer the land. So one way of explaining it is that the reason why the spies turned against God and they slandered the land, and they said we can't conquer it, which is very strange. After all, who chose these 10 spies? Moses did. Moses certainly understood people's qualities and their faults, and if he chose them, that means they were righteous people, they were good people, they were decent people. And yet, somehow, they turned into heretics, denying God's ability to conquer the land. That doesn't make any sense. And when they said that we can never conquer the land, why is the land of Canaan, even if you're not a holy person, but you see how many miracles happened before where they were able to overcome all their enemies in a very miraculous way? Couldn't God perform miracles? And the answer given in Hasidic thought is that, yes, it's true that God can perform miracles, and they were certainly in agreement with that. They saw it with their own eyes. But yet, they realized that though God could control everything and he could vanquish every negative force, he could overcome any obstacle miraculously, but they were told, and they were right about that when they enter into the land of Canaan, they're going to be acting within the parameters of nature. It's not going to be just glorious supernatural events, splitting of a sea where everyone who was their enemy is going to be drowned, and many of the other miracles that happened during the 10 plagues and beyond. No, everything is going to be a natural phenomenon. Everything is going to be done in a natural way. And to that worried them, because they felt that when you are dealing with nature and you're dealing with doing things within the parameters and limitations of nature, we don't have the power to overcome the enemy. The enemy is stronger than us. They underestimated their own power. Why? Because they were so into their own special qualities. They were so arrogant that they felt that they could determine whether they could conquer the land successfully or not. And they said, yes, if God is going to do miracles, we agree that God can do anything he wants. But if he's going to stop doing miracles, they are going to overpower us. The forces of evil are indeed stronger than the forces of goodness. To go a little bit deeper into this, there's a Hasidic work, I believe it's Knesset Heschel, a 20th century Hasidic work, who gives a very interesting explanation of the spies and their mission. He says in the Gemara, the Talmud, that a person should have a fixed place for prayer. That means if you daven, if you pray in one place, don't look for other places. Keep to that place. What's the reason for that? So the reason given is that when you pray in a place, you leave some of the holiness of your prayer in that location. That means that the place in which you prayed is no longer the same as it was before. It became a holy place. Now, if you pray there again, the holiness that has remained from the previous time praying will help you in achieving whatever spiritual experience you want to have the second time you pray, and the third time it's even more. In other words, by praying in the one place, you always have support from the spiritual energy that is embedded in that place. You know, there's a very interesting interpretation of the words in Ethics of the Fathers, that if two people are studying Torah, two people are sitting together, and there's no Torah discussed between them, it's a place of scorners. It's a location of scorners, which is a little harsh. Just because they're not saying Torah, it means they're scorning, they're ridiculing God or Judaism or Torah. So there's one very cute explanation that means that if two people are sitting, two Jews are sitting, and these are two Jews who are knowledgeable of Torah, and they're not exchanging words of Torah, that means that there were scorners that were sitting there before and left their mark on that place, that the place itself became degraded, and therefore they were not inspired to speak words of Torah. They tell a story, it's a very powerful story, of a chassid of the Kotzker Rebbe. The Kotzker Rebbe was known for his sharpness and holiness, and this chassid was childless for many years. We came to his Rebbe, and he said to him that he wants the blessing for a child. And the Rebbe says, I'm sorry, I can't help you. It's not something I could help you with. You're, as far as I could see, I guess in the spiritual realms, you're not capable of having a child. Of course, he was dejected. He was very despondent, very, very upset. And as he traveled back home, he stopped off in an inn, and he prayed Ma'ariv, the evening service, and he poured out his heart to Hashem. A few months later, his wife was pregnant. And he had mixed feelings. Obviously, on one hand, he was excited that his wife is going to have a child. But on the other hand, he was a little bit embarrassed that his Rebbe, the one he looked up to as being a holy person, said something that isn't true, that he could never have a child, and here he had a child. So you're probably guessing that because he prayed such a heartfelt prayer, it changed the decree, but that's not the way the story ends. So he comes back to the Kotzker Rebbe and he says, I'm a little embarrassed to ask you this, but thank God my wife is expecting. But you said it's not possible. You looked into the higher worlds and you saw that I'm not destined to have a child. How do you explain the fact that my wife is expecting? And the Kotzker Rebbe said, believe me, what I saw was correct. But when you went home and you stopped off at that inn to pray, once before, the Chose of Lublin, the seer of Lublin, he was one of the great disciples of the younger disciples of the Maggid and later on of Rabbi Melech of Luzensk. He davened there, he prayed there once, and he left his mark on that place, and that was what allowed your prayer to soar all the way up there and to break all the barriers. And that's why you were able to have a child. That means that if you're in a place where holy people in particular did something spiritual, something godly, that makes that place more receptive to your prayers. And therefore, a person should always try to stay in one place, the same place when they pray. What does that have to do with the spies? Land of Canaan was known for its depravity. There were two places on earth that were the most depraved places, Egypt and Canaan. That's what the Torah says. And here they're going from Egypt, from the frying pan to the fire. And here they're supposed to create a holy land. That's what the spies couldn't understand. How is it possible for us? This is a place that has such impurity in it. How could we change it? They didn't believe that a Jew has the power to overcome even the most depraved, the most lowly forces of impurity, because they covered up their holiness, their internal holiness, with their own egos. Yeshua had another problem. His problem was his humility. Even though he didn't have an ego, on the contrary, he was humble, but because of his humility, he would say to himself, if these 10 spies who are much higher than me, they're much more spiritual than I am, much more advanced than I am, and they realize that they can't overcome the obstacles, the spiritual obstacles in this land that we're supposed to conquer, how could I, the lowly Yeshua, how could I overcome these obstacles? Who am I? In the face of comparing himself to the others. And that's why Moses had to pray for Yeshua. He couldn't pray for the others because it says, Hakol bidei shamayim, chutz miyirah shamayim. Everything is in the hands of heaven except for fear of heaven. In other words, if you can't pray that someone should do only good and not do any evil, because ultimately it's up to that individual. That person has to have the fortitude to overcome whatever obstacles there are. The fact that Moses sent them should have been enough. And they should have realized that they're going with the power of Moses behind them, and therefore they would succeed. But their egos cover them up. They thought they're going on their own, that Moses recognized their superiority, and that's why they were chosen. And therefore they denied themselves the ability to use the power of Moses, and they didn't look at their own spiritual side that would enable them to conquer the land. Yeshua had another problem. His problem was not his Yetzer Hara, his evil impulses, which he had to learn how to control on his own if he had those impulses. But here it was his holiness, his humility, that he didn't feel that he had the power because of how lowly he was. And that's why Moses had to pray for him specifically. And when Moses prayed for him, it wasn't just a prayer. Moses was giving him some of his own energy. It says that Moses was like the face of the sun, and Yeshua was like the face of the moon, which means that Yeshua reflected the light of Moses, and therefore he was able to overcome and conquer the land subsequently. The same thing is true with us today. We have many challenges, and sometimes we feel that we can't overcome them because, after all, it could either be the negative way, the way of the 10 spies, that we have big egos and we deny our spirituality because we think we're so great. And sometimes it could come because of our spirituality. We feel so humble in the face of Moses in the face of Mashiach. Who are we? We're little spokes in a wheel. How could we change the world and bring Mashiach and elevate the world and transform the world? It's our humility sometimes that could cause us to shirk our responsibility to be the ones who will finally bring Mashiach and the final redemption.